Welcome back. In this next part of lecture, we're going to begin to explore specific components involved in planning a funeral. It can seem daunting or overwhelming, but it doesn't have to be. In order to better understand what's all involved, let's look at what happens from the time a person dies until the final disposition, or final resting place for their body. When someone dies at home, in a hospital, or a nursing home, somebody is called. Depending upon how they died and what environment the person died in, the funeral home director may be called right away. Other situations, based on what happened or the policies of the facility where someone may be living, it may be required for them to first call an ambulance. Either way, the person is confirmed dead, and someone from the funeral home carefully and respectfully takes the body to their funeral home. In situations where there was a violent death or someone died as the result of a crime, then an ambulance or coroner may be called. The person is confirmed dead, and in some cases, an autopsy may be requested. This may be requested by law enforcement or even by the family. Once the autopsy or any investigations are complete, then someone from the funeral home will come and carefully and respectfully take the body back to the funeral home that the person or family have chosen. In some cases, if the person who died has no family, if they've already made arrangements, the funeral home will carry those out. But if they have no money for a funeral and no family to help make these decisions, then the county can either bury or cremate the body depending upon state statutes. It's important to know that everybody will have a final resting place, whether it's burial or cremation, and no one's body will just be kept in a morgue forever. Now, I know that some of these circumstances seem hard to imagine or unfamiliar, and that's okay. The idea is just that we be informed. Most people in the United States have a funeral or memorial service, so that's what we're going to focus the rest of our discussion on today. Once a person's body is taken to the funeral home, then what happens? Who helps? What was called an undertaker in the past, we've seen this term evolve over the years to be called a mortician, from the word mortuary, and now we most commonly call this person a funeral home director. This is the person who is involved every step of the way, from when they get the first call that the person has died, and they go get the body from the home, hospital, nursing home, etc. They help prepare the body, they assist the family in making funeral arrangements, and they may even help conduct the funeral or memorial service in some cases. Clearly, they have a very important role in this process. Most funeral home directors are very kind and approachable. And they have to be, right? I mean, you wouldn't want to go meet with someone who's stiff and standoffish at a time like this. They need to be warm and caring. As suggested, they do a lot of behind-the-scenes work as well. On the right-hand side of this column, we'll see what's involved in preparing the body. The funeral director will wash the body, and if the person is going to have an open casket, they also need to be embalmed for sanitary reasons, as it helps prevent the spread of disease or infection. We talked about embalming briefly at the very beginning of the semester when we looked at how procedures evolved following the Civil War. Basically, the blood and all other bodily fluids are removed from the body, and a mixture of chemicals is added in its place. This helps to preserve the body and slows decomposition so that the body may be viewed by others at the visitation, wake, or funeral. With embalming, it also allows more time to pass between when someone dies and when the funeral service is held. In the past, and still in many cases, people need to be buried within 24 hours, such as within many Jewish or Muslim traditions. In these cases, embalming may not be required. However, if it's going to be much longer than that, or if they want to have an open casket, then embalming is standard practice. The mortuary has to have permission to embalm, which helps protect the family's wishes. The funeral director also helps get the person's body ready for the funeral service. If there's going to be an open casket, they may do the person's hair, makeup, fingernails, get them dressed, and they can also do some restoration work if there was any trauma to the face or hands, or anything that may show in the casket. The funeral director will sit down with the family to go over options regarding services. Based upon the family's preferences and any potential input from the person before they died, they will decide if they want to have a service, and if so, if they want a funeral or a memorial service. But what's the difference? Are they the same things? Well, not quite. A funeral is a ceremony that is held to honor the person who died. Funerals are usually before the burial, and it's common for the casket with the body to be in the same room. There may be an open casket, which is where you can see the person inside, or it may be a closed casket, and you cannot see inside. Much of this depends on the culture or religious customs, the preferences of the family, or the nature by which the person died. Many people benefit from actually seeing the dead person because then they know they've really died. Sometimes, if they can't ever see them again, they have a hard time believing the death was real. At the same time, however, if the person died in a violent or traumatic way, it may be more problematic to have everyone see them in that unnatural state. Many people want to remember the person for how they looked when they were younger or healthier, and thus they may not want to see them in the casket. Either way, it's really up to that person, if they had expressed their wishes prior to dying, as well as the family and the funeral home. Some cultures always have the person visible to those in attendance, while other cultures never show the person. Many people prefer to be cremated, so they have options as well. For example, someone could have a funeral with their body in a casket and then be cremated after that. Or they may have been cremated already, and the family has their cremains there in an urn. Ultimately, there are really lots of options for funerals, and there's not a right or a wrong way for everyone. If the person's body is not present, the family may still have a memorial service. This could technically involve the same types of components, such as songs, readings, scripture, photos or mementos, and so forth. If we look at the right-hand side, we see visitations, wakes, or viewings. These are different words for a similar type of ritual in which family and friends gather before the funeral. It may be the day or the night before, or possibly even a couple of days before. They're able to visit, to share stories and memories, to offer support to one another, and they may be able to view the deceased at that time. These can be held for the public to attend, or they may be private and just for those who were specifically invited. Then we see the word eulogy. This is a Greek word that means to praise. In the cases of funerals, a eulogy may be given by someone who is close to the person who died, and it provides them an opportunity to share special memories or messages with those in attendance. It's a way for them to talk about the person who died. Not everyone has a eulogy, though, or some people may have several family members or friends participate in a eulogy in their honor. Again, variation here is okay and good. These are things that the funeral home can help families in deciding and planning. The nuances and specifics of funeral planning are very personal. Funeral practices may vary not just by ethnicity, culture, or religion, but by each family and even the individual person. For some, funerals may be expected to follow a strict regimen of prayers, scripture readings, and rituals. Or for others, funerals may be more of a celebration and laid-back approach to remembering the person who died. Have you ever thought about what you would want at your funeral? Would you want it to be big and open to the public, or small and reserved for family members and close friends? Would you want people to send flowers, or rather to make a donation to a charitable organization in your honor? Do you want a religious service or a more secular service? Would you want it held in a church or a funeral home? What type of music do you want played? Any specific songs? How about certain poems, readings, or scripture? Do you want any scrapbooks, photos, or other visual art displays out to show the highlights of your life? What do you want to wear? Is there a specific person, be it a religious leader or funeral home director, that you want to lead your funeral service? Do you have a preference for what funeral home you might like to use? As you can see, there are lots of things to think about, a lot of choices to make. Depending upon one's culture and family beliefs, there may be an expectation that people talk about funeral wishes ahead of time, or that may be seen as taboo and is discussed by family only after the person actually dies. In the U.S., we're seeing a trend of people pre-planning their funerals. Not only does this help make it more personal and ensure that the person has specific components incorporated or avoided, but it also takes some of that decision-making pressure off the families who may already be exhausted and overwhelmed. These are important things for us to consider from a professional perspective as well as a personal perspective. As part of your life planning portfolio, you'll be asked to consider your own preferences for your funeral or memorial service when you die. So start thinking about these things now. What would you like or not like, and why? At the same time, or even before you start planning the actual details of a funeral or memorial service, you need to decide what form of disposition you'll be using for the body. In other words, does the person want to be buried in a cemetery? Do they want to be entombed in a mausoleum, which is an above-ground burial building on cemetery grounds? Do they want to be cremated and then have their cremains stored in an urn, or possibly dispersed? Or do they want to donate their body to science? What they want to have ultimately done with their body may impact whether they have a funeral or memorial service. For example, if they want a funeral with their body present, it can then later be buried, cremated, or donated to science. Or if they want to be cremated or donate their body to science right away, the family may choose to have a memorial service without the body actually being there. Again, there is no absolute right or wrong way, so the best bet is to try to follow the wishes of the person who died, if you're fortunate enough to know what those wishes were. And remember, there may well be cultural or religious guidelines that dictate what is done. For example, as we see in this first picture, Hindus are often cremated on a funeral pyre, and then their ashes are poured into the river Ganges. Irish Catholics may be buried with a Celtic cross as a headstone. Sometimes even geographical terrain makes a difference. If someone lives at or below sea level, for example, you cannot bury their body below the ground. Instead, they'd be more likely to have mausoleums, like this cemetery in New Orleans here that we see up above. Or in places with limited space, like the Philippines, in the far right picture, they reuse burial space, cleaning out the old bones and making room for new ones. It may sound impersonal, but people have to deal with the reality of the constraints around them. Sometimes there's just not enough space. Like with the Philippines, they're on a small island. You're going to eventually have everything taken over by cemeteries if you don't have an alternative, creative way to handle the death of several people over thousands of years. Other people have personal choices. Maybe it's just their own preferences about what they want to have done, such as burial at sea, or their body being left on a high platform to be exposed to the natural elements or left for birds of prey, which is something we saw in the past with many American Indian tribes. Some people today are even using cryogenesis or freezing of their body. So there's a lot of different options to think about. For those choosing burial or cremation, here are some other words for rituals that we commonly see associated with this part of the process. The procession, or funeral procession as you hear it called, refers to the hearse as it carries the casket and body from the site of the funeral to the cemetery. The hearse is followed either by a long line of cars driving or by a line of people walking on foot. And I have two photos here as an example. The top one I think is taken in England with kind of an old-fashioned car as the hearse and the family members walking immediately behind it and then cars behind them. And the picture in the middle is a picture here in America of a common funeral procession that we see. On the bottom here, we see what's happening is called a committal. This is the ceremony that's held at the graveside or at the crematorium. It's a ceremony that takes place right before the casket is lowered into the vault in the ground, or before the urn is placed in the mausoleum or columbarium, or before the body is taken to the crematorium. So it's kind of this last little service or farewell before the person's body meets its final resting place. For those who wish to be buried, state regulations outline what can and cannot be done in specific cemeteries. For example, most cemeteries require that the person be buried in a casket and that the casket be placed in a vault. We see information about caskets on the left side and vaults on the right-hand side of the screen. A vault is a box that the casket goes into, which is then sealed. So the vault, it may be made out of concrete or stone, like marble, or maybe even steel. This not only helps in maintaining the physical structure of the cemetery, primarily in that it prevents graves from sinking under pressure, but it also serves as a protective barrier, which is important from a public health concern. There are some exceptions made in certain cemeteries in some states. For example, some Jewish cemeteries do not require vaults. However, standard practice in most states is that a vault must also be purchased at the same time as the casket. We can see examples of various caskets and also a concrete vault on the slide. They have caskets and vaults in different sizes depending upon the size of the person who died. So if a child were to die, for example, you wouldn't have to have an adult-sized vault and casket, but rather you could purchase smaller ones that better fit the deceased child. On the flip side, if you have someone who was very large, possibly morbidly obese, you may need to purchase a slightly larger casket. For many people, the casket is what serves as the centerpiece of the funeral activities. Not only does it contain the person's body, but oftentimes it's at the front of the room. It's carried in and out by pallbearers from the funeral home or the church to the hearse and then to the cemetery. It's often adorned in flowers or other special mementos. It may even be draped with the American flag if the person served our country. Many people have different views about caskets. Some people feel they have to be the nicest casket available, embossed with gold, bronze, or silver and silk linings, while others prefer a simple wooden casket. Sometimes people feel pressured into buying up or purchasing a fancier casket than they really want or need. They may have family members applying this pressure, or society, or even their own guilt may play into it. Regardless, know that there are lots of caskets available, from a simple one that costs around $1,000 all the way up to the Cadillacs of caskets that may cost upwards of $25,000 or more. There are options, so don't be embarrassed to ask what their full selection is. And if there's something that you're looking for that the funeral home doesn't have on display, they can still get it for you. You just need to ask. Not everyone wants to be buried, though. Some people prefer to be cremated, and for a variety of reasons. For one, cremation is cheaper than burial. It also allows people to take their loved ones with them if they're mobile or move a lot. Some find solace in biblical references, such as ashes to ashes, dust to dust. There are also many creative options for disposition. For example, you could put the cremains in a pretty urn to either take with you, or the urn itself can be buried in a vault. It can be enclosed in a columbarium niche. It can be interred in an urn garden, or many other ideas. I've seen some beautiful marble benches that have a spot that opens up for someone's cremains to be inserted and then can be engraved with their name or special message. Oftentimes you'll see this as part of someone's garden, either at their home or their church or school or so forth. One of my first families at Teddy Bear Hollow had their infant daughter cremated and her cremains compressed into a pink diamond, which the mother then wore on a chain around her neck. Some people want their cremains scattered over the ocean, at their favorite fishing spot, or on the family farm. Each state has different regulations about scattering cremains, and many will say that it's illegal. I can't tell you to break the law, however, I'm not sure who would really ever know that you did it or how you'd get in trouble. We do need to acknowledge, though, that some people are scared of cremation, as they don't really understand the process. It's not often discussed as part of routine conversation. Some people struggle with envisioning it, as they attach feelings and senses. People worry that it would feel too hot, But we have to remember that the person is already dead. They don't feel anything, hot or cold. But let's talk about cremation, though, so it's not quite so scary. Again, there are lots of different options. If someone wants a funeral and a visitation first, they can simply rent the casket from the funeral home for the service so they don't have to buy an expensive one. Then, when the funeral is over, the body is taken to the crematorium. Other people may want to be directly cremated with no funeral or service first. Either way, once the body gets to the crematorium, it is placed in a rigid container, usually made out of sturdy cardboard. The container and the body are then placed in an incinerator where they are exposed to intense heat. It's much hotter than any oven or stove that you've ever used, and the body kind of melts like an ice cream cone. At the end, usually after several hours, depending upon the size of the person who died, all that's left are some ashes and possibly parts of the bigger bones, such as the femurs. These remains are then put through a machine called a cremulator, which kind of grinds them down into ashes that are like coarse dirt or gravel. The cremains, which is the term for cremated remains, are then put into a box. When finished, the cremains of most average-sized adults would fit into the box the size of a shoebox. The family can then put the cremains into an urn or other type of disposition that we discussed a few moments ago. In all honesty, I used to be pretty uncertain about cremation. It sounded hot and scary and just uncomfortable, and thus I assumed that no one would want it. However, as I got older, and as I became more involved with supporting grieving families, I learned early on that cremation is preferred by many. One of the most powerful experiences of my life was when I had an opportunity to visit a crematorium. I know it sounds morbid, but it really wasn't. It was part of a grief training workshop that I was taking, and we went to a building that housed a crematorium. It was not at all what I was expecting. We got inside, and there was a nice family room area with couches and a fireplace and magazines. The staff was very welcoming and kind. They gave us an opportunity to go into another area that had windows with curtains pulled closed. They explained that they had 2 incinerators behind the curtains, and that if we wanted to, and we did not have to, that we could stay and look through these windows as they pulled back the curtains. I remember feeling nervous and sweaty, even a bit lightheaded, but I wanted to see and learn. I wanted to overcome this fear. They pulled back the blue curtains, and what I saw was actually very comforting. The 2 incinerators had openings that remind me of those old-fashioned pizza ovens with the curved kind of arch openings with rock around the edges. There was a small metal slit that was on the front of each incinerator door, so they could slide it to the side and peek in to see when the cremation was complete. They asked if anyone wanted to see inside. Mind you, we were still behind a wall in a different room, so we weren't really right there looking into it. We were probably 6 or 8 feet away through a glass window. A few of us said yes, and they slid open this small screen. There wasn't a whole lot to see at that point, as the cremation was almost complete. I could see 2 femurs, but that was about all. The person explained that as the body melts under the high heat, it actually goes back into the fetal position. To me, I found this comforting, like the cycle of life and death. I mean, we start out in the fetal position, and then through cremation, we go out in that same fetal position. This experience took away all the questions and the what-ifs and those scary unknown images that were in my mind, and it replaced them with an image that was very respectful and comforting. That's what shifted my own personal views, actually, as I now wish to be cremated when I die rather than buried. Now, I have seen other crematoriums that look more industrial and less personal, but I really like this first one I saw. It might not be for everyone in a culture that leads toward burial, but in other cultures, cremation is the norm, and for some, it's the only option. But I wanted to share my experience with you so that you would see it in a different light, that it could be seen as comforting rather than just scary or unknown. Thanks for letting me share. That being said, there are other options aside from a traditional burial underground or setting an urn on top of your fireplace. Here we see some other forms of disposition, particularly variations of entombment. First, we see mausoleums, which are an above-ground structure where one or more bodies or cremains are entombed. Here we see an example of what one might look like from the outside, as it's typically part of the cemetery, and next to it we see what a mausoleum may look like on the inside. I know the picture is not the biggest, but you can see several places where the front opens and caskets are slid inside. These structures are usually made out of stone, such as marble. Next, we see a columbarium, which is a different kind of above-ground structure. These have openings or niches for urns with people's cremains. Here it's in the form of a brick wall. I've seen them also as like a marble wall. So the family can purchase one of these niches or openings in the columbarium, and then the cemetery directors put the urn in and seal it with some type of plaque or front door that may be engraved and may have photos, a place for flowers, and so forth. The next two kinds of entombment I'm going to show you aren't as common in the United States, but were certainly the norm in different parts of the world for thousands of years. First, we see a picture of some catacombs. This one happens to be from a catacomb outside of Rome. I've been in one of these when I was there several years ago, and it was fascinating. You go down lots of steps to about 100, 200, sometimes even 300 feet below the ground. There are lots of passageways, like little roads winding around, and there are places that hold bodies from the floor to the ceiling. And that's what we see a picture of here. These little slits are actually long, probably about 6 feet long a piece, and the body would be placed into those openings. Now, because it was so far underground, it stayed very cold, so they didn't have to worry about a lot of problems with, really foul smells or the stench becoming overpowering, because there was no heat to really speed that decomposition process. So it was cooler and dark, so it was a slower decomposition process. And this is how a lot of people in these areas were buried at the time. Like I said, it was cool and dark. They've added lights now for the tourists, and so they certainly were an important part of history. Finally, on the bottom here, we see an example of a crypt, which is also below ground, and were typically below churches. Even the most famous churches like St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City or Notre Dame in Paris have crypts below them. Prominent church leaders, politicians, or community leaders may have been buried below, and in some cases, normal everyday folks like you and I back in the day. Again, these types of crypts aren't used much around here, but they're very common in different parts of the world. Takeaway point, if you ever have a chance to visit a catacomb or a crypt and take a tour, I highly encourage you to do so. They're fascinating. Regardless of whether one chooses burial, cremation, or some form of entombment, we are seeing more creative and ingenuitive ways to personalize services and memorialize the person who died. We have grave markers, headstones, and monuments that mark where the person is buried. These can be simple or elaborate. Some simply have a name or a date of birth and death, while others have engraved carvings and pictures. Each cemetery has its own guidelines and regulations for what types of headstones can be there. In older cemeteries, for example, it was common to see lots of big, tall monuments as grave markers. Now, as they've become much more expensive, and as cemetery grounds crews want to streamline the process of mowing and maintaining the lawns, we're seeing more requirements for flat grave markers that aren't as easily knocked over or run into. If you've never noticed that cemeteries have different requirements, next time you're at one, take a look around and see what types of headstones are most common. How old are they? How easy is it to maintain the grounds around them? Does the cemetery have policies about flowers, mementos, or other items being left at the grave? As part of this, we can look at the epitaph, or the actual words that are inscribed on the headstone itself. What variations might you see in a cemetery? If you could decide now what your own headstone would say, what would it be? I'd like you to take a minute to think about it, to push pause and jot down your ideas here for your own personal reference. What would you want included? Your name, date of birth and death, age, relationships, like if you were a spouse or partner or a parent or a friend? Any hobbies included? What would you want that legacy to be? So push pause and write down some ideas about what you'd like your headstone to say, and when you're finished, push play to continue. Okay, so that first part of what we just looked at was all part of examples within a cemetery. But what else? How about inscriptions or plaques that honor and remember the person who died? We tend to see these at places like church, their former place of employment, even nonprofit agencies or organizations that promote causes the person cared about. Maybe the family made a donation in their honor, and then a plaque or engraved brick was put up. On a totally different note, it's also pretty common to be driving and to see a memorial decal or sticker on the back of someone's car window, or to see a t-shirt with a picture of someone and an in loving memory or RIP message across it, or even tattoos with the person's name, their image, or their footprints if it was a baby or young child who died. The picture here is from the back of a car window that we see on the slide here. Of course, electronically, we have all kinds of ways to now digitally memorialize others. Just look at Facebook pages that are maintained or even set up after someone dies, or online scrapbooks or websites devoted to people who died or the causes they cared about. One thing that we need to mention, because oftentimes people have no idea, is the fact that while the funeral home is there to care for the body and support the family, it's also a business that has to generate funds in order to keep operating. They can't do all that work for free. That being said, there are fees attached to different types of services they offer. These fees range from minor to more expensive, so it's good to be thinking about these things when you're making plans. Here's a short list of some of the things that you have to pay for, either at the funeral home, through the church, or even for others involved in carrying out the funeral and burial or cremation. Take a moment to glance at the list just so that you're aware. As we looked at recently with the benefits of making advance directives for your healthcare wishes, it's also important to consider your wishes for funerals, memorial services, burial, or cremation. Families are often under a lot of stress, and they're experiencing a roller coaster of emotions when they're trying to set everything up. So it can be a big relief for them to already know what you'd want. Even better, it's nice when those funeral plans are actually written down, or possibly even paid for in advance. This isn't always possible, of course, and in some cultures it isn't even acceptable. But for many in dominant American culture, funeral planning is seen as not only acceptable, but also desirable. This reduces the stress. It cuts down on family arguments, tension, or even guilt in deciding what to do or not to do, and it saves time. One has to consider the financial obligations as well, which is why prepaying for part or all of your funeral plans can also be a nice gift that you give to your family. Many funeral homes are also willing to set up a payment plan so that you can use any life insurance money, if the person had any, to help pay off those funeral costs once the money arrives from the insurance company. You'll have a chance in your life planning portfolio to consider what we've talked about in this week's lecture and come up with your own specific ideas and preferences for what you would want or not want and why. This is a meaningful and valuable exercise, so I encourage you to start thinking about it now and even consider sharing it with others so they're aware of your wishes. As we prepare to take our tour of a local mortuary and cemetery, be thinking about questions that you have. We'll have an opportunity to ask them questions, so come prepared with some in mind or even written down. Keep in mind that they may touch on many of these things while we're actually getting the tour, so be sure to listen and then feel free to ask for more information. They're here to help us learn, and they're more than willing to answer any questions you have. Remember, we are not going to see the preparation room, which is where the bodies are washed and embalmed. You can still ask questions about that process if you're curious, though. Be sure with any questions that you ask that they're worded in a polite, respectful manner, and the funeral home director will do their best to answer. As we walk through the cemetery as the second part of our upcoming tour, we will want to be conscientious of cemetery etiquette. To be more specific, it's important that we be quiet and respectful, especially if we're visiting a cemetery in general for this tour and we're not actually there for a specific person who died. It's also important not to walk across the tops of graves or on headstones. Instead, try to always walk in between the graves so you're not walking on the bodies and caskets buried below. That could be seen as very disrespectful. Do not remove any items from graves. So if someone has a set of some flowers or mementos there, leave them. If there are stones on top of a grave, leave those there as well. This is a common Jewish tradition, but may also be common among others as well, and we don't want to disrupt that type of memorial. Certainly do not vandalize, push over, step on, or even sit on headstones or larger grave markers. They are not furniture, nor are they public property, so please treat everyone and everything with respect. I obviously don't anticipate any problems from our group, but it's always good just to have those ground rules set so we're all clear on the expectations. I also thought it was interesting because I first learned cemetery etiquette from my own parents. We would always go on Memorial Day and sometimes other days up to the cemetery, to kind of visit with great-grandparents or others who had died. And my parents taught me early on, not to walk across the graves or touch anything. And so even though I don't expect problems with you guys on our tour, for those of you that have children or want to have children someday, that can be a valuable lesson that you pass on to them as well. So for those of you who are touring the mortuary or cemetery on your own, because maybe you live outside of the Omaha area or your schedule doesn't allow you to attend with the group tour, you'll want to be sure that you take your own list of questions with you. I'll be following up with you with more information as it gets closer, but these are some good things to be thinking about. And again, with that life planning portfolio that's due soon, you'll want to be thinking about your own preferences on these various topics as well. If you have any questions, be sure to let me know. Otherwise, I'm excited to see you all soon. Have a great week.